had always imagined my ranch as a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world could not touch me, where every sunrise painted promise across rolling hills and every sunset whispered quiet peace. For years, I poured my heart, sweat, and sleepless nights into shaping it, building fences, planting trees, and carving pathways that led to secret corners where the wind hummed softly through the grass. Each stone, each nail, each layer of soil carried my effort, my love, my vision for a space that would reflect freedom and self-reliance. It wasn't just land. It was my identity, a testament to patience, planning, and the dreams I had nurtured since I first set foot here. I believed that hard work and respect for nature, combined with care for the community, would shield me from conflict. And yet, one ordinary morning, that belief shattered. The bridge leading to my property, the very structure that connected my world to the rest of the land, was gone, torn down, splintered with scattered across the shallow stream, its reflection fractured like the certainty I had always felt. The HOA had done this, not by accident, not by mistake, but deliberately. Their reasoning was wrapped in bureaucratic jargon, citing obscure clauses, obscure rules, irrelevant to the reality of my life, my property, and the years I had invested. I felt an initial wave of disbelief, a surreal numbness that made me question if this was a nightmare I could wake up from. But soon, disbelief gave way to anger, and anger ignited clarity. I realized in that moment that this was no longer about a bridge. It was about principle, boundaries, respect, and the assertion of rights that could not be ignored or bargained away. I spent that morning pacing along the wreckage, my fingers brushing against splintered wood, my mind replaying every moment I had built that bridge, every hour of thought that had gone into its design. The HOA's actions were not merely inconvenient. They were an affront, a declaration that the sweat of years could be dismissed with a bureaucrat's pen. The anger I felt was visceral, but I understood that acting in haste would only play into their perception that I was reactive, irrational, unprepared. I needed a strategy, a plan that would reclaim what had been taken while asserting power and agency in a way they could not ignore. Late into the night, under a sky sprinkled with stars, I drew maps, sketched layouts, and calculated possibilities. It was then that the idea struck me, old world, audacious, and perfectly fitting. I would dig a moat, not as an act of vengeance, not as mindless retaliation, but as a calculated demonstration of boundaries, a physical and symbolic barrier that would convey a clear message without breaking laws or resorting to aggression. Every foot dug, every drop of water filling the trench would become an emblem of strategy over emotion, foresight over impulsiveness, patience over frustration. Over the following days, I planned every detail meticulously. I measured elevations, calculated water flow, and considered the proximity of the HOA's new development relative to my ranch. I recruited local helpers, people skilled with the land, accustomed to the long hours and sweat-soaked labor that the task demanded. The excavation began at dawn, the rhythmic sound of shovels striking soil marking the start of a slow, deliberate transformation. Each mound of earth represented more than physical war kit, symbolized agency reclaimed, a challenge articulated without words. Neighbors peeked through fences, whispering, some incredulous, some impressed, all captivated by the audacity of creating a moat in response to bureaucratic overreach. The HOA, at first oblivious, would soon understand that the quiet landowner they had dismissed was capable of ingenuity, patience, and calculated resistance. Every day, I refined the moat, ensuring water levels, banks, and boundaries were precise. The trench became a living, breathing entity, a combination of physical and psychological strategy. The moat demanded patience. Early mornings were spent inspecting and adjusting, afternoons ensuring the structure's integrity, evenings planning the next stage. As the water began to flow, glimmering under the sun, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This was not chaos or destruction. It was assertion, control, and foresight rendered tangible. Meanwhile, I documented every reaction, every movement of HOA representatives who eventually noticed the change in landscape. Their confident steps faltered. Their questions became cautious. Their letters and calls more measured. The moat had already begun to shift the dynamics, redefining who held influence and how interactions would unfold. I observed with calm fascination, knowing that the most powerful form of authority often lies not in shouting or fighting, but in creating circumstances where respect becomes unavoidable. Evenings were reflective. I would sit by the water, watching its ripples under the moonlight, letting the silence of the ranch absorb my thoughts. The bridge's destruction had been a catalyst, but the moat had become a symbol of strategic empowerment. I understood then that conflict is rarely about aggression alone. It is about foresight, patience, and the courage to act when the world expects passivity. The land became my partner in this silent negotiation, each feature of topography leveraged to assert control, each action a measured statement. By transforming adversity into opportunity, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming not just a physical path to my home, but also my narrative, my power, and the principle that effort and vision deserve respect. As the days turned into weeks, the moat began to integrate seamlessly into the ranch's landscape. It was no longer a shocking spectacle, but a natural, powerful boundary that conveyed authority without aggression. The HOA began to realize that their unilateral power was limited, that they could not act without considering consequences, and that one determined landowner could influence outcomes without raising a single voice. The process was transformative not just for the land, but for me. I learned that agency is not granted. It is created, nurtured, and defended with intelligence, patience, and creativity. By combining physical action with psychological strategy, I had shifted the power dynamic, creating a space where respect was unavoidable, boundaries clear, and the narrative firmly in my control. Reflecting on this first phase, I recognized the depth of lessons embedded in seemingly simple actions. The bridge's destruction was a minor event compared to the insights gained about human behavior, institutional rigidity, and the potency of strategic thinking. By observing, documenting, and acting deliberately, I turned a moment of violation into a long-term advantage. The moat, in its quiet strength, became more than a defensive measure. It became a metaphor for resilience, foresight, and the ability to reclaim control when circumstances seemed stacked against you. I understood then that true power often lies in subtlety, in patience, and in the courage to transform anger into action that commands respect without resorting to destruction. By the end of the first month, the moat was complete, flowing, and fully functional. It had reshaped interactions, shifted perceptions, and demonstrated unequivocally that my ranch, my vision, and my effort were not to be dismissed. The bridge would eventually be restored, not through apologies or concessions, but because the principles I stood for had been communicated in the most undeniable way, through action, strategy, and unwavering resolve. In the quiet that followed, I finally appreciated the power of measured response and the lessons embedded in patience, strategy, and ingenuity. This was only the beginning. The days following the completion of the moat were a study in tension, observation, and quiet psychological warfare. I spent the mornings walking the edges of my property, noting how the sunlight reflected off the water and the way shadows shifted across the trench, creating a visual barrier that was as intimidating as it was functional. From a distance, the HOA representatives began to notice, their casual confidence slowly replaced by caution. I watched as their confident strides faltered near the perimeter, as they glanced at each other with subtle unease, and I realized that the moat had already begun its work. It was not only a physical structure but a symbol, a reminder that their power had limits, and my resolve could not be underestimated. Every day, I observed their reactions, cataloging the subtle changes in body language, tone, and approach. They were used to compliance, to people accepting rules without challenge, but in my case, each cautious step spoke volumes. They were confronting someone who did not simply react, but who strategized, adapted, and controlled the narrative in a way that left them unprepared. I knew that the next phase required careful communication. Letters alone would not suffice. Words had to be paired with presence, consistency, and demonstration of capability. I drafted correspondence to the HOA that was precise, calm, and professional, outlining my commitment to the community's rules while clearly asserting my rights and the principles that could not be compromised. I took care to avoid inflammatory language, yet each sentence was crafted to establish a balance of authority, subtly reminding them that while I respected the system, I would not tolerate arbitrary overreach. In parallel, I spoke with neighbors, sharing insights into the situation, explaining the rationale behind the moat without seeking approval or creating division. These conversations were strategic. They humanized the story, fostered understanding, and created allies in subtle, indirect ways. People began to perceive the moat as a demonstration of intelligence, patience, and thoughtful defense rather than anger or retaliation. The narrative was shifting quietly and powerfully. Meanwhile, the ranch itself demanded attention, a balancing act that tested endurance, time management, and emotional resilience. Daily routines, feeding livestock, inspecting fences, maintaining water systems, intertwined with overseeing the moat's development and monitoring HOA activity. Every adjustment to the trench, every check on water flow, and every reinforcement of embankments was done with meticulous care. The work was physical, exhausting, yet profoundly empowering. The act of building, shaping, and refining the moat reinforced a psychological truth. Strategy is not abstract, it is embodied. It requires consistency, diligence, and an understanding that influence grows from action as much as from observation. Slowly, the trench transformed from an audacious idea into a seamless part of the landscape, a silent yet undeniable testament to patience, foresight, and deliberate effort as the moat settled. Its influence became increasingly apparent. The HOA began approaching communications differently. Initial letters, full of authority and expectation, gradually became more measured. Phone calls were hesitant, each word carefully chosen, each statement weighed. The physical presence of the moat had altered the social dynamics, creating a situation where they could no longer act unilaterally. Their perception of control had shifted, a subtle acknowledgement that the quiet landowner had introduced an element they had not anticipated: leverage. This was the power of strategic patience, creating circumstances where respect, attention, and caution are unavoidable, where actions speak louder than words, and where authority is balanced by intelligence and foresight rather than confrontation alone. In tandem with external observation, I focused on internal resilience. Patience alone is insufficient without discipline. Anger, if untempered, risks impulsive decisions that undermine strategy. Each day, I walked the ranch alone, absorbing the silence, feeling the rhythm of the land, and letting the natural order calm the mind. I meditated on the meaning of boundaries, power, and influence. The moat became a metaphor for measured response, for the ability to transform adversity into advantage. Its presence was both physical and psychological, a tool of negotiation without confrontation, a symbol of assertiveness without aggression. This introspective work fortified my resolve, ensuring that every subsequent action would be intentional, effective, and aligned with the overarching strategy of maintaining control over outcomes. Weeks passed, and the moat had become an established feature, integrated naturally into the landscape yet impossible to ignore. The HOA's attempts to provoke, intimidate, or challenge were now impotent, their letters carefully phrased, their calls cautious and limited. Each interaction reinforced the understanding that strategic action, when executed with precision and patience, creates influence far beyond the immediate confrontation. I saw the shift not only in their behavior but in the subtle respect developing among neighbors, who increasingly recognized the effectiveness of foresight over impulsiveness. The moat had become a visual, tangible narrative of what it meant to assert oneself thoughtfully and deliberately, challenging norms without chaos and commanding attention without aggression. A night, sitting by the water, I reflected on these weeks of transformation. The destruction of the bridge had triggered more than tactical planning. It had ignited a process of self-discovery, highlighting the importance of strategy, foresight, and emotional intelligence in conflict. The moat had evolved from a reactive measure into a symbol of autonomy, a manifestation of principles enacted through action rather than words. I realized that power is often subtle, residing not in volume, force, or threats, but in the ability to create circumstances that compel recognition, respect, and acknowledgement. By combining observation, strategy, and measured action, I had shifted the dynamics entirely, creating a space where my authority and vision were respected without a single raised voice. By the end of the second month, the moat had achieved what I had initially hoped for and more. It was not just a defensive measure. It was a statement of capability, intelligence, and foresight. The HOA, while still present and active, approached interactions with caution and a newfound recognition that unilateral action would no longer suffice. The land, which had once been a passive backdrop, had become a partner in strategy, a canvas upon which I had painted lessons of resilience, patience, and the profound power of deliberate, measured action. The bridge's reconstruction would eventually happen, but the true victory lay not in restoring a physical structure, but in reclaiming control, asserting boundaries, and transforming adversity into a demonstration of principle and influence. As the moat settled into its role as a formidable boundary, my focus shifted to the deeper implications of what had begun as a simple act of reclamation. I started to realize that every interaction, every subtle ripple of water along the trench, carried lessons far beyond the immediate conflict with the HOA. There was an almost meditative quality to the work, a rhythm that intertwined physical labor with strategic observation and mental clarity. Each morning, as sunlight painted gold across the hills, I would walk along the edges of the moat, watching the reflections of trees and sky shimmer in the water, and feel a quiet sense of triumph. Not a triumph born from vengeance, but from control, foresight, and the transformation of adversity into a tool of influence. The moat was no longer merely a defensive measure. It had become a living symbol of resilience, a tangible representation of the principle that those who plan and act with patience can shift outcomes far more effectively than those who rely solely on authority or intimidation. The HOA, still active and occasionally attempting to assert dominance, began to exhibit behaviors that were almost comical in their cautiousness. Letters arrived with careful wording, phone calls were measured, and representatives approached conversations with a level of politeness that bordered on hesitation. I observed these changes with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. It was a subtle form of influence, one that required no shouting, no confrontation, yet exerted undeniable pressure. The moat had altered the landscape of authority, transforming the way interactions unfolded, and teaching an essential lesson. Real power is not in brute force, but in the strategic manipulation of perception and circumstance. Each day, as I performed routine tasks on the ranch, feeding livestock, checking fences, maintaining irrigation, I was simultaneously reinforcing my autonomy and the lessons embedded in the moat's presence. This period also forced me to refine my skills in communication and narrative. I realized that the way I framed my actions, both in writing and in conversation, would influence not just immediate outcomes but long-term perceptions. Every letter I sent to the HOA, every conversation with a neighbor, every explanation of my intentions had to be precise, measured, and aligned with the larger strategy. I was not merely defending property. I was constructing a narrative of intelligence, calm authority, and deliberate action. This required a level of discipline that extended beyond physical labor into psychological and social acuity. The moat was the physical manifestation, but my words, my demeanor, and my consistent presence were equally vital components of. As weeks turned into months, I began to notice subtle yet significant shifts in the neighborhood dynamic. Neighbors who had initially been curious, skeptical, or indifferent began to view my actions with a newfound respect. Conversations that once carried doubt or mild criticism evolved into acknowledgement of strategy, ingenuity, and patience. The moat had become more than a physical barrier. It was a lesson for the community in the power of thoughtful action over impulsive reaction. It demonstrated that one does not need to fight fire with fire, that intelligence and foresight could command respect and achieve outcomes far beyond immediate confrontation. These realizations deepened my understanding of influence and reinforced the importance of patience, planning, and observation as fundamental tools in any conflict. Meanwhile, I continued to refine and expand the moat. Adjustments to water flow, embankment stability, and vegetation around the perimeter were all part of a deliberate plan to ensure both functionality and aesthetic integration into the landscape. The goal was not to create an eyesore, but a boundary that felt organic, natural, and undeniably powerful. The land itself became a partner in strategy, a medium through which subtle lessons about resilience, foresight, and consequence could be communicated. Every ripple in the water, Every reflection of sky and tree carried symbolic weight, reminding both myself and observers that deliberate action creates outcomes that cannot be ignored. The moat had evolved from a reactive measure into a proactive instrument of influence, teaching lessons without words, commanding attention without confrontation, and asserting boundaries without aggression. I also spent considerable time reflecting on my personal growth during this period. The act of creating the moat, observing reactions, and maintaining discipline taught me lessons about patience, strategy, and emotional resilience that extended far beyond land disputes. I learned the value of deliberate action, the power of perception, and the importance of remaining calm under pressure. I understood that conflict, when approached thoughtfully, could be transformed into opportunity, that setbacks could serve as catalysts for strategic advantage, and that true influence often comes not from aggression, but from the careful orchestration of circumstance. Each day reinforced these lessons, and each evening, as I sat by the water's edge, I contemplated the broader implications for life, leadership, and the exercise of authority in a measured, intelligent manner. By the end of this period, the moat had achieved more than its initial purpose. It was no longer merely a barrier. It was a living testament to the effectiveness of patience, strategic thinking, and the transformation of adversity into empowerment. The HOA, while still present, had become a secondary player in the dynamics of the ranch. Their attempts at intimidation or control were now met with calm, measured responses, reinforcing the principle that true power lies in preparation, foresight, and the ability to act with deliberate precision. The land, the water, the reflections, and even the reactions of those who observed all combined to create an ecosystem of influence, a testament to the profound effectiveness of thoughtful, strategic action. Finally, I understood that the journey was far from over, yet the foundation had been laid. The moat had become a symbol, a strategy, and a lesson in resilience, foresight, and patience. It had reshaped not only the physical landscape but the social and psychological dynamics surrounding my property. What began as a response to destruction had evolved into a profound exploration of agency, influence, and the power of deliberate action. The bridge's demolition, once a moment of crisis, had ignited a transformative process that redefined boundaries, asserted autonomy, and demonstrated the true effectiveness of strategic patience. Every day, I observed these shifts with a mixture of satisfaction and strategic analysis, noting which approaches elicited respect, which gestures reinforced authority, and which elements of patience and foresight amplified the overall impact. Throughout this period, I maintained a personal regimen of reflection and mental discipline. The physical labor of maintaining the moat and the ranch was intertwined with the cultivation of focus, emotional resilience, and strategic thinking. I spent hours walking the property, contemplating the lessons embedded in every ripple of water, every bend in the embankment, and every tree that lined the perimeter. These quiet moments reinforced a crucial truth. The moat was effective not simply because it existed, but because it embodied intentionality, discipline, and the application of foresight. It was a manifestation of deliberate thought translated into action, demonstrating that true power often lies not in aggression or volume, but in the careful orchestration of circumstance and perception. As the weeks progressed, small victories began to accumulate. Misunderstandings with the HOA were resolved before they escalated. Minor provocations were preemptively neutralized by observation and measured responses, and the perception of my authority solidified. The moat had become a strategic anchor, a reference point for interactions that reminded both neighbors and HOA representatives that deliberate planning, patience, and action could influence outcomes in profound ways. Each day reinforced the narrative that I had constructed. Adversity could be transformed into leverage, challenges into opportunities, and the boundaries of influence could be expanded without resorting to aggression. The natural integration of the moat into the landscape further enhanced its effectiveness. It was no longer a stark, disruptive trench but a living, breathing element of the ranch, blending with the terrain while maintaining its symbolic and practical impact. Wildlife adapted to the presence of water, vegetation grew along the embankments, and the reflection of sunlight on its surface created a visually compelling statement that was impossible to ignore. Even the casual passerby could sense that this was a space marked by deliberate intention and mindful control. By harmonizing the moat with the environment, I ensured that it was sustainable, resilient, and continuously reinforcing the principles it was designed to communicate. By the end of this period, I recognized the broader significance of the actions I had taken. The moat was more than a boundary. It was a living testament to strategy, patience, and the application of foresight in the face of adversity. It had reshaped not only the immediate interactions with the HOA, but also the social and psychological landscape of the community, teaching lessons that extended far beyond property lines. What had begun as a defensive response to destruction had evolved into a profound demonstration of autonomy, influence, and the power of deliberate, intelligent action. The bridge, once destroyed, now seemed insignificant in comparison to the lesson embedded in every ripple, every embankment, and every carefully observed interaction. I had created more than a moat. I had created a narrative of empowerment that would endure far longer than any temporary obstacle or challenge.